Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I get going. So, as I'm Swiss, I have to be on time. And as there's going to be drinks afterwards, even more. Otherwise, So I'm the last show between the drinks, and well, my name is Patrick Fry. I'm the CEO and founder of Venture Valuation, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to evaluate companies and how to evaluate specifically products and deals. So that's kind of the topic of today's workshop. So I've been, maybe just a few words why I'm doing this workshop. So my company is called Venture Valuation, so that already gives it away what we do. We do independent valuations of companies and of products. So I've been doing that for the past 19 years. Working either with investors who want to invest in companies, or working with companies who are raising money and need to know what's the value of my company. What's how much equity do I give away to a potential investor, or working with companies who want to license a product to see what kind of licensing deal terms can I get for my product. I think the session before there was some question about the price and value, and so hopefully I can answer some of the questions that came up. One thing is always, people, one thing is, people always say, well, why should I do a valuation? Because, the investor will tell me what he's willing to pay. And my standard answer to that is there's price and there's value. There's two different things. At the end of the day, you can do all the valuations you want. If you don't find a buyer for it, the valuations won't help you. But if somebody gives you a price, with the valuation, you will be able to see, if that is within a fair range or not. And it gives a tool to have a discussion with the potential investor around the price. But at the end of the day, it's supply and demand. So what do we do? Quickly, what I'd like to go through is, how to do a product valuation. So one asset. So we focus on one asset. How to do a valuation of an asset. Just to have an overview, and then I try to give you a quick introduction into RNPV. Does anybody know what RNPV is? So you have some people who have never heard of RNPV. Also a few. Okay. So we have a look. This is kind of the gold standard what big pharma companies are using to evaluate their assets, their products, their pipeline. So I try to give you a crash course on RNPV. It stands for risk-adjusted net present value. And then there is a few things about how to look at the deal, how to look at the deal structure, how you can use that for negotiation. And then I have a case study that we can go through, and depending on time, I can show you how that it can be used. If you have any questions, just let me know, or we can also, we will do a Q&A at the end as well. So I already mentioned, my company Venture Valuation. We do independent valuations. We also have a database where we work with Life Science Nation together. It's called Biotech Gate. I'm based in Switzerland. That's why we say we do an independent, neutral valuation. It fits very well. But we do valuations all over the world. We are currently working on a valuation of a Chinese company that does a reverse merger to NASDAQ. A colleague of mine is in New Zealand, of all places, to do a valuation there. So really, wherever there is biotech and pharma and also medtech companies, we do valuation of life science companies. The first client that I had when I started was Novartis Venture Fund. So we work with, pharma companies, we work with VCs, family offices, and then a lot of companies. So this is the slide, and what I mentioned before. There's price and there's value. There's two different things. So Warren Buffett once put that very nicely. Price is what you pay, value is what you get. So if you go to an investor and he gives you a price, that doesn't mean this is the value of the company. An investor would like to invest at the reasonable or low price and sell at the high price, right? And you as a company, you would like to get as a high value or high price as possible because you don't want to be diluted. So So there are different interests, and at the end it's supply and demand, who drives the price. What we do when we do evaluation, we try to give a basis what could be a fair value or value range. And it's more of a tool that helps them to negotiate or find a price. So we try to give the companies like an idea what is a fair value, and if a price is offered, that they can then decide, I go with that offered price, or maybe I'm not happy with that, or I would like to have maybe some other options. So evaluation is often a basis then to negotiate for investment decisions or also for licensing deals. So evaluation of a product, if you look at just one asset, what we do the evaluations for is for licensing deals. Most of the time the question is, what kind of deal terms could I expect? If I have a product, I want to out-license that today, or what could I expect if I out-license it tomorrow when I reach certain milestones? So that's most of the time the question when we look at individual products. But sometimes also you have, as a company, you have a broad range of different products, and you have to choose which one you want to focus on, or which indication you want to go for. And so valuations can also help with strategic decisions. So this is kind of the main reasons why we would do a product valuation. Now, to do a product valuation, what we try to do is to map kind of the whole investment phase, and then also the revenue phase, and so we look at the development costs and development timeline. So how much does it cost, and how much time does it take to develop the product, to bring the product to the market? We look also at the production cost, at marketing cost once the product is on the market. We look at the expected sales. We look at the cost once the product is on the market, and we look at the success rate. So what's the probability that we actually bring the product to the market? So these are kind of the different input factors that we use. And what we get at the end of the day is we are trying to calculate what are the future cash flows. What are the risk-adjusted cash flows? So what profit will the product generate in the future? So it's like a discounted cash flow, but we will risk adjust everything. So basically this, again, the same thing. We look at the development phase. So this is the investment phase. So this is where we have the clinical trials. You have the success rate, so you might or might not make it to the next clinical trial. So the attrition rate. And then you have the market phase where you have the revenues. And what we typically would do is we would calculate, or we would estimate until end of patent life. So we would try to estimate what could be potential revenues for the product until the patent expires. So you see that here you have the cost, the development side, and then you have the revenues, and then at some point, revenues go down because there's other products coming to the market, competitors, or you have the end of the patent life. So what normally we don't use a terminal value. So terminal value, because we look at such a long period of time, we don't do then a terminal value. And then we have a discount rate, so basically the risk. The non-product specific risk is replicated in the discount rate. But I come back to these different factors. This is just to give you kind of the bigger picture. So let's have a look at this RNPV, risk-adjusted net present value valuation approach. So I'll go through that step by step and try to give you kind of an introduction or like a view what kind of information is necessary. So I try to kind of split it up in 5 different steps. When we do evaluation, we go through these different steps. So again, we look at the development phase, then we look at the market phase, we try to understand what is the risk, And then we do the adjustment for the risk, so the probability of success. So this is the non-product development specific risk, and this is the development specific risk. So what is the probability that we make it from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3? So we split this risk in 2 different parts. And at the end, we add up the cash flows, and that gives us the value of the product. So I go now through these different steps, and I have an example that I can take you through just to kind of illustrate that a bit. So let's assume we have a product, a phase 1 product. We take a discount rate of 20%. The probability of success from phase 1 all the way to the market is 11%. And these are real numbers, real figures. So this is it also illustrates, you need to have 10 products in phase 1 that one makes it to the market. So this is reality. Now, if we look at the cash flows that this product generates, just the cash flow is about $2.2 billion over the lifetime of the product. By the way, I will put these slides on our website so you can download it. You're happy to take pictures, but so I will have everything on the website so you can, makes it a bit easier. So cash flows, $2.2 billion of this product over the lifetime. Then if we discount these cash flows to the present value, discount the cash flow with the 20% discount rate, we are about 127 million. Most of these cash flows are 10 years in the future and more. You can see that here. So towards the end, right? So that's when you have the peak sales, that's when the product makes most of the money. So that's why the discounted cash flows are relatively low, 127 million. Now if you risk adjust it, so there's only an 11% probability that we will make it to the market, that the product will make it to the market and generate any positive cash flows. If we include that, then we're at $8 million. So the risk-adjusted net present value of this product is $8 million. Yes?
Yeah, so I'm curious, if you're risk adjusting afterwards, which is a great thing to do, the discount rate of 20% seems like an absurdly high discount rate.
Well, you still have a lot of non-product development risk that you have to include. For example, can the company get financing? You have a management risk. You have IP risk. So, I mean, maybe it's not 20, it could be lower, right? I mean, this is just an assumption, but it's, if we would not include a risk adjustment, the discount rate could be 50%.
Agreed.
Yeah. So you have to make sure you double count it, but this is not unreasonable. Yeah. I mean, a big pharma, they have discount rates or cost of capital where that's somewhere maybe 8 to 10%. But as a biotech company, you don't have the cost of capital of a big pharma. You can't get debt financing, so you have a different cost of capital. So your discount rate will typically be higher. Okay. So if we look now the development phase, so this is where we have to try to understand what is the cost of the development. So basically, what is the clinical trials cost? So how many patients do we need in the different trials? Where do we do the clinical trials? What type of treatment is it? We have to manufacture our product, right? So that's also a cost that's often very heavy for companies, because before you start clinical trial, you have to have GMP material. You have a CRO that you have to pay. You have some additional costs that you have for clinical trial. So we try to estimate. Often the company might know what the phase 1 will cost, how many patients, but then phase 2 and phase 3 might be a bit more difficult. But you still have to include that. And also, even if the company out-licenses the product, you still have to include this cost. So we are including costs that anybody has to pay for, no matter if, it might be a big pharma when you out-license it, or it might be the company itself. But in the overall calculation, you have to include this. So we're trying to see, in terms of number of patients, the cost per patient. There's some additional cost. We might have a quote from a CRO, then we can be maybe a bit more specific. We can look at timelines of other products that have been developed and see how long did the clinical trial last, how many patients did they have. So there's a website, clinicaltrial.gov, where you have all this information publicly available. So we're trying to come up with an estimate of these costs. And at the beginning, if you have a preclinical product, some of these things might be quite difficult, but you have to start somewhere, and we have to make some estimates. But this is kind of the information that we are trying to put together, working with the company, understanding, what is the development plan for the product. So that's the development side. Now we look at the market side. There's basically two different approaches. You can do a top-down or a bottom-up approach. Top-down, you would try to see what is the market, what is the sales of comparable products. How much revenues does a comparable product make? Typically, we would do a bottom-up approach where we try to really understand how many patients are there, what is the prevalence of a specific disease. We might have only a subgroup of patients that we can treat. What kind of market share can we get? How fast can we go to peak sales? What kind of pricing can we get? Maybe it's different prices in Europe versus the US. So we're trying to kind of build that bottom up. And then we use the top down to kind of compare and benchmark to see that it kind of fits. We also look at the product life cycle. So you don't start with peak sales when you bring a product to the market, right? So you have to build your sales. And depending on the product, if you have an orphan drug, you can get to peak sales very quickly because you might know exactly where the patients are. There might be nothing on the market, so you can get your sales quite high quite quickly. If you have a product which you have to distribute through the GP, and it will take a long time to maybe educate the doctors, make them aware of the product. There might be other solutions that the doctor use and they're happy with the treatment. So depending on the product, these life cycle curves can look quite different. And you always have, at some point, you have the sales will drop down depending on the IP. So typically you have IP maybe here, and the IP expires, and you would expect maybe generics or biosimilar coming to the market, and depending on that, you have a drop in price and in revenues for the product. And at some point, we would stop. Even though there might be some additional value, but typically we would, kind of see here 15 to 20 years. So what we see here is basically we built that then for the different regions. So we have the patient population, you have an incident rate, you have maybe a diagnosed population, so not everybody who has this disease is actually also diagnosed. You have a percentage of patients that are being treated with the drug or with drugs. You have a compliance rate, not everybody is taking their drug, so these are all factors that will reduce the size, the market size or the addressable population. Then you have a market penetration, so this is the life cycle. And then market share and the price. And so this is kind of how we calculate potential market bottom up. And we do that for different regions. And typically the closer to the markets, the more specific you would do these calculations. For example, in Europe, if you have a preclinical or phase 1 product, we would probably do the calculation for the whole of Europe. If it's phase 2, phase 3, you would start looking at what are the different prices that you can get for the product in the different countries. But at the beginning, because the product is still so far away from the market, probably makes sense to group, just looking at the bigger geographical areas. So if we come back to the example that I showed you before, if we have the 8 million, that was with about a peak sales of $1 billion. So if you have this product makes at peak sales $1 billion per year, that gives us the present value of 8 million. If the peak sales drop to 700 million, our value drops to 3 million. If peak sales increase to 2 billion, our value increases to 25 million. Now you might wonder, well, if it doubles, peak sales, why doesn't the value double? It's more than double. And the reason is simple, because our development costs are the same. No matter if we have $500 million in peak sales or $2 billion, our development costs are the same. So obviously then if you have blockbuster and you can maybe add additional indications, that makes it very interesting. And you can reach a higher value. Okay? So after we look at the cost, the development cost, we look at on the market side, we have now the discount. And here we have different discount ranges that people use. And it depends a bit on the stage of the product. So if you have an early stage product, you have typically a higher associated risk, IP risk, financing risk, management risk. If you have a later stage product, you have a lower discount rate because you have a lower risk. And this is the non-product development specific risk. And these are kind of the discount rates that people use. And you can see a bit the impact down here. It has a big impact. So with the 20%, we have 8 million. If we increase to 25% discount rate, we are at 2 million. And if we drop the discount rate to 15%, we are at 21 million. So here we have it's a time value of money, because our revenues will be sometime 10 years and plus in the future. So the present value of these revenues are obviously discounted, and that's why we have a lower value. So that reduces the value today, the present value of these future cash flows. So this is one side. Now the other side, and this is the very specific thing for biotech products, is the adjustment for risk. So what the probability that we actually are successful in the clinical trial. This is quite unique in this industry. So there's quite a lot of data out there in terms of what is the probability for different products, for different indications, for the different phases of development. And you can see here the different indications. So the highest probability of success from phase 1 all the way to the market is infectious diseases, autoimmune disease, and the lowest is oncology. So in oncology, we have about a 7% probability that the product will make it all the way to the market. In infectious diseases, it's about 17%. That's overall phase 1 all the way to the market. Now there are again different probabilities for different stages. Phase 2, phase 3, and you can see here phase 3, for example, oncology is relatively low, 45%. Whereas for infectious diseases, we have 65%. And this historical information, this can be the basis for the calculation. So when we do evaluation of a product, we typically would start, this would be our starting point, but we would adjust these probabilities based on the assessment of the product. You might have a product where we would say, the probability of success for phase 1 is higher than on average, or might be lower. But this is a good starting point. And basically now what you have is, with every step, with every clinical trial, you either, it's binary. So it's either positive and you will continue to invest and go to the next clinical stage, or if it fails, you typically would stop and you have lost the money that you invested so far. Right? And you want to, obviously the goal is to be successful and make it all the way to the market, so you have a cumulative success rate. And the impact now, that's actually the interesting thing is that the impact of the development of the value is you have these steps. So every time you pass a clinical trial successfully, the value of the product will jump up immediately, right? Because you eliminate that risk that you might fail. And this is what you can see in the share price of publicly listed companies, especially one product companies. If they report a successful clinical trial, you will see how the share price immediately increases. That's exactly this effect, because this probability that the clinical trial will be a failure, you eliminate that. And the same thing, if a company reports a failure of their lead product, then the share price will go down. Right. So you can see that the value of the product will, go up in these steps over time, over going through the different clinical trials. And if you go back to the example I showed you at the beginning, we start at the 8 million for the phase 1. If we're successful in phase 1, our value will go up to 18 million, then 125 million, 477, and then 672 million. So this is every time we pass a clinical trial successfully, we have this jump in value. So this is specifically this risk adjustment. So the question is, how can we use that? When we look at deals, we look at deal terms, we look at negotiation. If you have a product and you want to license that to a pharma company. So basically you can, when we do evaluation for such a deal, what we do is we start doing evaluation of the full product. So that's the first step. And then the question is, how is the value of the product shared between the licensee and the licensor? Right? You can only do a deal if both, actually have some value. Right? If you do evaluation of the product 8 million and you ask for 8 million up front, and the pharma partner, they don't get any value. They will probably not do the deal, right? But if you say, well, we want 4 million for it, then it's a 50-50 share of the value. But then, you have more complex deals where you have an upfront, you have milestones, and you have royalties. And then the question is, how do you put that in perspective? If I reduce my royalty rate, how much more upfront do I get for that? And with doing such evaluation, this is actually what you can do. So a payment of 1 million upfront today, the net present value of that, the risk-adjusted net present value is 1 million, because you get that today. There's no strings attached. 1 million, it's 1 million. If you get a milestone payment, say at the end of phase 2 of 1 million, the present value in this example is $17,000, because it's sometime in the future. So you discount it, and you might never get there because there's a probability that you will fail in the trials. So the further out, the lower the value of your milestone payments. And if you hear these deals, 500 million deals, this sounds great, right? But the pharma companies, they call that bio-dollars, because they know they probably don't have to pay that, or there's a probability that they will not have to pay this money because the product will not make it to the market. Just statistically, based on historical data, a lot of products will not make it that far. But this helps also then to see what is the value of 1% royalty. So you can calculate that, and then that helps also in terms of doing discussion with the big pharma. If you do a licensing deal, you might want to increase your royalty rate, but how much do you have to reduce your upfront payment? And each company has different requirements in terms of the upfront milestones, but this helps you to kind of look at different deals. And you might have two different deals, but at the end of the day, in this case, you have a 25 million upfront and 5% royalty versus a 5 million upfront, 12% royalty. You know, if you look at those two deals, it's very difficult to say which one is better. And in this case, this is another example, but these would be the equal, the value to the biotech and to the, you know, is in both cases is the same. But you take, the biotech takes different risks, right? So here, if you get 25 million upfront, you know, you take much less risk. You get the money today, and if the product makes it to the market or not, you still have these 25 million. Here you have a high royalty percentage, and you will only make money if the product makes it to the market. You benefit here, the upside is much higher, but the risk is higher. So it's also risk and reward at the end of the day. Okay, so I have a kind of a quick case study that I can show you as well, just to kind of put things a little bit in perspective. I know it's a very short time to explain a very complex area. Normally I do that, you know, in a full day valuation workshop, but you know, I think it's just still to kind of give an idea how this works and what the different aspects are. So in this case study, let's assume we have a mid-sized pharma that wants to license a product from a biotech. It's in pancreatic cancer, so it's finished phase 1. We have a prevalence rate, we have a patent expiry, and we have the biotech proposes a deal. So their proposal is 25 million euros upfront, 90 million in milestone payments at market entry, and what else? We have 10% royalties. I can't even see that.
It's only 5%.
So it's cut, yeah. So the question is now, is that a deal that, you know, the pharma company should do or not? So that's like a real question. So what we would do is now, we look at the market. You know, we can look, there's a competitive product. If we do a top-down approach, we can see what kind of revenues this competitive product achieved. So we can see how fast they were up to peak sales. So it took them 8 years to get to peak sales, but they made $1.6 billion in peak sales. So we can use that as a benchmark. They had a market share of about 60%. So we can use that. There's some other products in development, so we know that there might be some competition. So we do a top-down, a bottom-up valuation. So we use the prevalence, we use the population, diagnosed population, and we can estimate what our product, what potential peak sales, or what the sales curve could look like. So we do that for Europe, we do it for the US. Maybe we just look at these two markets because that's what the biotech company wants to out-license. So we can calculate, you know, peak sales. So here I think we have $1.4 billion. So we are quite similar to what the competitive product had. So from that perspective, that looks quite reasonable. So we leave that, and you know, these are our sales forecasts. In terms of the development cost, we know for phase 2 it would take about 2 years and cost 18 million euros. For phase 3 we would estimate the number of patients and the cost per patient, and we would estimate that it would take about 3 years. So we can calculate the cost for phase 3, and then the approval in the US and in the EU we estimate about 3 million euros for that, and it will take 1 year. So with that information, plus then you know, some of the cost we have, the marketing cost, the cost of goods, we can create this discounted cash flow or risk-adjusted discounted cash flow model. So we have the cost per year that we have in the development, and then when the product comes to the market, we can calculate the free cash flow. And we have at the bottom now. Let me just. So down here we have the free cash flow per year that we can calculate. Now what we still have to do, we have to look at the probability. So it's an oncology product. We have phase 2 probability is 42%, phase 3 55, approval 83. So the cumulative probability of success from phase 2 onwards is 19%. If it would be from phase 1, it would be 15%. But because we're already in phase 2, we have this a 19% probability that the product will actually make it to the market. So what we can do now, we apply the probability of success for each year and see, what are our costs and what's the probability that we will have the additional costs for the next year, or what are the probability that we actually have the revenues when the product gets to the market. So when the product is on the market, there's a 19% probability that we have these revenues. And then basically at the end we can add up the value of the risk-adjusted net present values, and we get a value of about 53 million for this phase 2 ready product. So the total value is 53 million. So we have the proposed deal of the biotech. So the question is now, is that a fair deal that the biotech is proposing? 25 million, 90 million in milestones, and 10% royalty. So just looking at that is difficult to say, huh? But we can now put that in perspective. So the deal proposal, 20 million upfront, 19 million upfront milestones, and 10% royalty. That would give the pharma about 18% of the value, or present value would give them 15 million. And the biotech, with that deal, for that product, they would get about 72% of the value, or 38 million. So if the pharma is not desperate to do the deal, they probably will not go for that deal, right? And you can say, well, a fair deal could look like something like, fair meaning if the value is split, which is not always the case. A lot of times pharma, they have the higher bargaining power. They will typically get a bigger percentage. We typically would assume the pharma getting about 2/3 and the biotech will get 1/3 of the value. Especially if it's the first deal for the biotech, and if it's a bit earlier stage product. But a fair deal, a 50-50 deal, could be about 6 million upfront, 90 million in milestones, and 10% royalty. That would give then both parties about the same value of this product. So, just to kind of conclude and make sure we have a few minutes also for some questions. At the end of the day, valuation is critical for any biotech company. If you run a company, you have to be able to increase the value over time of your product and of your company. So valuation is important. The question is, it's something that's very difficult to do. A lot of people, they say, well, valuation of biotechs, it's more an art than a science, or it's even a black art. So I leave that up to you to decide. It's definitely not something that's easy, which is good for us, so we have something to do. We have been doing that for 19 years, so we have some experience in it. But it's not an easy task. But at the end, you still have to do it. You talk to investors; they want to know, okay, how much equity do I get for my investment? You do a licensing deal. You need to know what kind of deal terms can you expect. So the value is basically the potential and the risk of the future. I mean, all these companies, when we do a valuation of a company, that's all pre-revenue. None of these companies, maybe they never make revenue because they're sold before they actually ever make revenue. So any of the PE or all these ratios, that they don't work. So it's really looking into the future. It's the potential, but the associated risk as well. So I always joke and say we have a big crystal ball in the set because you have to look into the future, and that's difficult. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So it's not an exact science. It's not possible. You can do all the calculation you want. At the end you will get a range of value, and it's an estimate. It's based on assumptions. So at the end it's all about the assumption. It's not the calculation. I see sometimes people, Excel sheets, and they go in very details, and at the end you have a value of 10.75 million. Well, it's very nice, but at the end, if you have a range, that's, I think, already good enough. It gives you some idea. But at the end of the day, it's the assumption. It's not the calculation. And it's, again, this is a value. It's not the price. What somebody else pays is a different story. An investor might have a different perception of the risk. So if he thinks your company or your product has a higher risk, he will offer you a lower value, a lower price. So one of the things, to increase the value of your company or of your product, there's two things you can do. You can try to increase the potential, right? That's one thing, and everybody thinks about that. But the other thing, what you can do is to decrease the risk. If you can decrease the risk, and even in the eye of the investor or of your partner, if you can decrease the risk, that will increase the value of your product or of your company. So that's another way that a lot of people forget. So with that, I'd like to close. Thanks very much for coming, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer if I can. Yes?
Have you used this approach for device and diagnostic companies?
Yes.
And are you able to get the same risk factors that have been developed?
No. So that's always a question. That's a problem. For device companies. So for device companies where you have to do clinical trials, you can do the same approach. The problem is that this historical data in terms of the probability of success is not available like for biotech, for the standard biotech products. But however, we still do and use this approach to evaluation of devices, but you need a bit more experience, and you have to make your own assessment and assumptions in terms of the probability of success. So you can't go back and look at historical data because that's not it's not really available like that. But we still use this approach, among others. So if we do evaluation, we do RNPV, but we also do market comparable, we do deal comparable, we do venture capital, so a method where we look at what could be an exit price. And that's also an interesting approach. When you have a company, think about what could be an exit value, and an investor will they want to make a return over the investment period. So if you can sell the company in 5 years for 100 million, an investor will not pay you 100 million today because he won't make any return over the time. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
So based on your calculation, if a company has, for example, 10 products in the pipeline,
yeah,
is simply calculating the shooting add together?
Yain. So theoretically, yes. So you look at the different assets that a company has, and you add up the different assets. But at the end of the day, a company is restricted by the resources that they have, right? And resources in terms of human resources, but also in terms of money. So you would only use or add up the products of the products that a company can realistically develop at the same time. And if you have a startup biotech company and you have 10 products in development, that's not realistic, right? Typically you would have to choose one and maybe a second one. But at the end of the day, you would add up the value of the different assets. Yeah, it's called the sum of parts valuation. So you have the different parts and you add them up. Other questions? Yes?
Do you do normally like average between optimistic and non-optimistic?
So we do a range. we sometimes work with different scenarios. So we have, you know, an optimistic scenario, or we have a kind of a more, well, a realistic and then maybe a pessimistic scenario. So that's a way, yeah. It depends a bit on the product and on the company. But also maybe different product profiles, you know, and that will give you different values at the end of the day. Or, you know, with one scenario you have maybe 2 indications that you could go for, and with the other one you have maybe only 1 indication that would work and you would include in the calculation. Any questions? Otherwise, I'm also around at the drinks outside, so I let you go. Thanks very much for coming, and yeah, have